I will reopen this meeting and we will continue in English this next session. And we have 4 guests. I would like to welcome our guest, Mr. Faes, who's present here in this meeting, and 3 who are present online. The first one is Mr. Azizi. The second one is Ms. Graveski. And the third one online is Mr. Westnich. We will do it. I will give you the floor, and you have a 5-minute time window to give your introduction point of view on Iran, and then we will go to a question and answer session. Unfortunately, there are only 2 members of parliament in this meeting, but that gives us also the opportunity to have an in-depth discussion with each other. I will continue the meeting and start with Mr. Faes, who can give his introduction. Mr. Faes.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I will briefly talk about the situation in the region.
Ik schors even de vergadering voor 5 minuten. I want to adjourn this meeting for 5 minutes, so please bear with us until 5 minutes. I want to reopen this meeting and also express my apologies to our guests, but we can now resume this meeting, and I want to give the floor to Mr. Faes.
Thank you very much, it is unfortunate that most people who are seeking democracy in Iran do not appreciate that you have to be the change you want to see and be tolerant of different views. I'll start by a broad brush of what's happening in the region and the risks that are faced ahead. I know you've had a long day and there are 3 other speakers ahead of me. Over the past 4 decades, the Islamic Republic has invested heavily in 3 main projects for projecting power and deterring its adversaries. Number 1 is a network of partners and proxies in the region that Iran has funded, trained, and armed. And of course, we have seen this network activated after Hamas's horrible attack on October 7th on Israel. We've seen cross-border attacks by Hezbollah. We have seen attacks by the Houthis threatening free flow of commerce in the Red Sea, and we have seen attacks by Iranian non-state allies in Iraq and Syria against U.S. forces. But if you look at the outcome of a year of confrontation between Iranian-backed axis of resistance and Israel and the United States, overall, the network has been degraded. Of course, Hamas is significantly diminished in terms of its leadership and its military capabilities. Hezbollah has been also degraded significantly, and therefore what Iran thought was its regional deterrence is no longer really providing it with the protective shield that it had in mind and it had invested over the past decades to achieve this objective. Therefore, it has engaged in something that was previously unthinkable, which are direct attacks on Israel, with the second policy that it has invested on significantly over the past 4 decades, and that's its ballistic missile program. It has today one of the most sophisticated arsenal of ballistic missiles. As you know, it has proliferated those missiles and drones to its allies, either state or non-state, be it Russia or these militant groups in the region. But Iran's missile attacks on Israel have also been relatively ineffective. The first attack of more than 300 drones and missiles was defeated by an alliance and by the Israeli multi-layer air defense system. And the second attack in October, although it had a higher rate of success, yet it didn't cause any significant destruction and thankfully no casualties in Israel. So the two main policies with significant amount of investment have not delivered what the Islamic regime had in mind in terms of deterrence. And that's why I think the third project, which is its nuclear program, now risks being considered as an alternative. Of course, this is easier said than done. Any decision to dash towards nuclear weapons would likely be detected relatively quickly. And we know this program has been deeply penetrated by Israeli and Western intelligence. And the dash in and of itself could in fact invite an attack rather than deterring one. And even if Iran decides to dash towards nuclear weapons, the weaponization part of its effort will take between 6 to 18 months. So Iran would not be able to, although it can enrich enough fissile material for one bomb worth of nuclear material in less than a week, but it would not be able to weaponize that and put it in a cone of a missile that would be deliverable. And therefore, in that period, it is still vulnerable to outside attack. But even as a nuclear weapon state, that wouldn't necessarily stop Iran from being target of conventional attacks by Israel or the United States. Iran itself has proven this point. This year, it has attacked Pakistan and Israel, two nuclear weapon states. And of course, moving in that direction also means that Iran would never be able to use its nuclear capabilities in the way that it has over the past 20 years as leverage in nuclear negotiations with the West to try to get economic incentives. And therefore, even that I don't think would provide the Islamic Republic with the kind of security that it has in mind. All of that means that you have a regime in Tehran that is cornered, and regimes that are cornered often behave in much more riskier ways. We are now awaiting Israeli retaliation for Iranian attack on October 1st, which is very likely then to result in another Iranian attack on Israel, this time probably with a higher number of ballistic missiles. And if we continue engaging in this tit-for-tat of attacks, eventually it would most likely spiral out of control. And that's a risk that I think everyone has an interest in trying to avoid. I leave it at that and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks for your contribution. Then we'll go to the second speaker, that is Mr. Azizi. He's the visiting fellow at German Institute for International and Security Affairs and research associate at Klingendahl. Mr. Azizi.
Thank you very much. Good evening. It's an honor to be here Thank you for the invitation to join this discussion. For the interest of time, I have prepared my remarks and I read them to you, and then I will be looking forward to the questions that might arise. So I'm going to briefly discuss growing partnership between Tehran and Moscow, which has become a critical feature of the Islamic Republic's foreign policy over the past few years. The relationship between Iran and Russia has entered a new unprecedented phase, which is shaped by two critical factors, the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. Traditionally, this relationship used to be somewhat one-sided, with Iran seeking Russian military and technological support. However, the Ukraine war has turned this dynamic into a two-way street. As Russia faces international isolation and significant military challenges, it has become increasingly reliant on Iranian drones, and more recently, there have been reports, of course, of the transport of Iranian missiles to Russia. On the economic front, both countries benefit from cooperation in circumventing Western sanctions, particularly through trade and financial agreements. Iran's full membership in institutions like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS, which was achieved with Russian backing, of course, could offer Tehran access to alternative economic networks, at least in the longer-term perspective. This contributes to deepening ties between Tehran and Moscow. Additionally, the two countries are also in the final stages of signing a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement, which will formalize their cooperation across political, economic, and potentially military domains. On the military front, Iran's role in supplying Russia with drones and potentially ballistic missiles has been a significant shift in their relationship. These tangible military assets bolster Russia's capabilities in its war in Ukraine, while Iran hopes to gain, and it has actually gained already, diplomatic leverage and increased influence in Moscow. Beyond ideological convergence on opposing the West, Iran's motivations for this cooperation are highly strategic. Iran is not merely a supplier, it is seeking advanced military technologies and know-how from Russia. Specifically, Iran aims to enhance its missile technology and air defense systems. For example, potential cooperation in the development of hypersonic missiles and the improvement of Iran's missile defense systems by, for example, the potential acquisition of Russian S-400 are among the priorities for Tehran. Besides, Iran is likely leveraging this partnership to gain access to more advanced fighter jets and space capabilities, such as satellite technology, for example. The fighter jets agreement has not been materialized yet, but in the field of satellite cooperation, we've seen some tangible developments. Another key area where this relationship could have long-term consequences is Iran's nuclear program, as was discussed by Dr. Wise just right now. With tensions escalating between Iran and Israel, Iranian officials increasingly speaking about the possibility of reconsidering the country's nuclear doctrine. If Tehran decides to militarize its nuclear program, Russia's position will be critical. While Moscow officially opposes nuclear proliferation in its official stance, of course, its dependence on Iranian support in Ukraine may soften its stance on this issue. Not to mention that in Russia as well, there has been discussions about the change of nuclear doctrine and lowering the threshold of the use of nuclear weapons. But despite this unprecedented closeness, the Iran-Russia relationship also faces significant challenges. Russia has tried to balance its ties with Iran against its relationship with the Arab states of the Persian Gulf, particularly the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Moscow's recent diplomatic overtures to these countries, including, for example, its support for the UAE's claim over the 3 islands in the Persian Gulf, have caused friction with Tehran, and this has actually highlighted the limits of this partnership. Additionally, tensions have emerged over the so-called Zangezur corridor in the South Caucasus. This proposed route, which is supported by Russia and Azerbaijan, would connect Azerbaijan to its Nakhchivan exclave through Armenian territory. that would mean cutting Iran's direct access to Armenia. And for this reason, Iran has strongly opposed this plan, and it sees this as a threat to its regional influence and basically as a geopolitical catastrophe in the longer term. In conclusion, while Iran and Russia are closer today than ever before, they are still far from being natural allies. Their relationship is primarily transactional, and it is driven by immediate geopolitical needs and shifting regional dynamics. Moscow's diplomatic balancing between Iran and Arab states, as well as disagreements that I mentioned over the Zangezur corridor, these elements actually reveal the limits of this, the significant limits of this partnership. But given the two factors that I mentioned, the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza, it seems that the security military cooperation between these two actors are still going to continue. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Mr. Azizi, for your contribution. And then we'll go to the next speaker. That is Ms. Garayevsky. She's the fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Ms. Garayevsky, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I'm going to speak mostly about kind of the changing strategic outlook that Iran has been experiencing over the past year, particularly related to its missile force and also its nuclear program. So as Dr. Vaez outlined, Iran's strategy has really been based around certain pillars like proxies, its missile force, and then looming behind it has been its nuclear program. In April, we saw probably the largest show of force since the Iran-Iraq War in a single military operation from the Iranians directly launched from Iranian territory onto Israel. And so the April attacks were significant symbolically, and they did indeed intend to damage Israel and actually cause some harm. However, just strategically, the way this operation was planned with cruise missiles and drones followed by ballistic missiles wasn't the most optimal strategy when you think about it militarily. Still within Iran, there was this perception that this established a new equation, that Israel would be more restrained in kind of its attacks on Iranian assets. However, we saw that this strategy failed. There was assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Iran moments after Pezeshkian was inaugurated as president, and then subsequently the assassination of Nasrallah. So this kind of combined with Iran's degradation of its proxies, but also the growing prominence of its missile force and its strategy. Since 2017, there's been a real push within the IRGC Aerospace Force to really increase and improve their conventional capabilities. And I think the April strike showed a bit of a weakness when it came to that. Still, while not being the most militarily optional strategy, it did show that Iran didn't have this kind of comparative advantage when it came to advanced Israeli air defense systems. I think the October attacks were quite different. Iran launched ballistic missiles, and some of them were more modern and also advanced ballistic missiles with multiple re-entry vehicles. So these are the ones that are by far more sophisticated when it comes to its missile arsenal. And I think it did show that it did overwhelm Israeli air defenses. And if you look at Iranian analysis right now, when it comes to Israel's delivery, or the United States delivery of THAAD to Israel, I think it does point to at least some Iranian confidence in their conventional missile capabilities. And I think that's important to caveat, because I think initially there wasn't as much of a view that this actually really was effective. However, looking at the satellite imagery and also the subsequent Israeli response to this, it does show that perhaps the conventional side of Iran's missile force is quite important, and it will likely be important going forward. But this is still looming. What's still looming behind this is its nuclear program. And there's been this increase of rhetoric amongst Iranian officials, even predating the April attacks, about its ability to reconstitute its former weaponization program, which was pre-2003. They definitely have the delivery vehicles for this. And as Dr. Azizi mentioned, this growing Russia-Iran cooperation could potentially be really valuable when it comes to their space launch vehicle program, which could eventually be an ICBM. So I think Iran faces a decision of whether or not they're going to either rebuild its proxies, either through the direct transfer of missiles or equipment, or focus more conventionally on its missile arsenal as a way of being kind of an effective deterrent because of its ability to produce this en masse quite extensively. But I do think that the nuclear issue is going to remain on the table, and it doesn't seem like it's going away. And this is all happening while there's decreased IAEA monitoring. And Iran has also done more work with uranium metal. I mean, not to the level necessarily for a nuclear weapon, but Iran has that experience, and that knowledge is quite difficult to remove. You can't really incorporate that into an agreement, which is this knowledge gained. So going forward, I do think that the main priority should be not only transparency and monitoring, but also dialogue with the Iranians when it comes to its nuclear program, and also restraining Israelis' responses on, particularly on nuclear facilities or even oil facilities, because I do think that this could provoke quite a dangerous reaction within Iran. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Grajewski, for your contribution. Then we will move on to Mr. Westnich. He's Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Studies at the Open University. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to be with three other scholars whose work I admire, actually, so it's good to see all three of you, and solidarity with you, Ali Jan. These people only want to silence debate, and it's a sad irony, I think, that they resort to such tactics when they see themselves being victims to something similar. So I'm sorry that you had to take the brunt of that in the room just now. Briefly, I'll just talk about a lot of my recent work has been on Iran and the axis of resistance. And I think what's happened of late, there's been a lot of quite triumphalist statements coming from a lot of politicians and policymakers, and indeed analysts, on the inevitable defeat and demise of the axis. And I think it is without doubt degraded, but I don't think it's going anywhere just yet. And if we look at the Levant more broadly, the region around Israel, then we can see an area of the Middle East where the axis was conceived, where it continues to hone its different strategies, and it's this interesting mix of a strategic alliance, a security community, an ideational network. And that's a part of a part of the Middle East, really, which was deemed critical to Iran's own national security. And as my colleagues have said, this idea of this region acting as a form of forward defence, maintaining Iran's strategic depth is well covered and has been a key feature of Iran's foreign policy in the region in the last 10 years or so, and longer, really. But Iran's conceptualization of the axis, it's this idea of this network group that has these strong ideational ties, but also common security concerns as well. And this military strategy has been conceptualized by Tehran in largely defensive terms, particularly vis-a-vis the aims and interests of the United States and its key allies in the region. The Islamic Republic has an acute focus on ensuring its survival, maintaining its national territorial integrity, seeking to forge a regional security structure in support of these objectives. So that's why it's often had this sort of approach with this forward defense and strategic depth type of approach, keeping the foes away from its borders. Now, obviously, that's all begun to change since the events of last year on October 7th and the increasingly brazen Israeli actions against Iranian interests, which we've discussed already. I think, for Iran, maintaining deterrence against Israel and the broader global forces that threaten its own national security and those of its allies, remain a key concern. I think it might recalibrate a little. It may well offer some diplomatic concessions. We've seen some mixed messages coming out from Iran in terms of negotiating on behalf of Hezbollah, for example. But I think its allies that it has remain an important feature of its foreign policy. Hezbollah is repelling Israel on the ground, if not in the air, and I think it's dangerous to assume that they can somehow be bypassed in any de-escalation on the Lebanese front. Coming back to Tehran, I think of note has been the Islamic Republic's efforts to assert this sort of perceived moral high ground in emphasising diplomatic channels and efforts to link de-escalation to a viable ceasefire deal in Gaza. We've seen regular appeals to various UN forums, the use of its warming ties with regional leaders, as important tools to assert Iran's position as a key regional and global actor in this conflict. That's what it wants to be seen as. And I think, we've seen Iranian diplomatic maneuverings being very prominent within the Middle East since its October 1st strikes against Israel, and those efforts seem to have made some inroads in forcing the US to prevent Israeli retaliation against all the nuclear facilities, certainly, and I think they may have helped in part with some de-escalation, though of course we remain at a very critical juncture, I'd say. We do have this ostensibly more open administration coming to power with the election of Pezeshkian. But I do think Iran will continue support for its allies in the Axis as they remain vital to its own security. I do think the new administration does offer an opportunity for Western states actors to have a more open interlocutor in terms of exploring possible avenues for de-escalation, though. Now, of course, we all know Pezeshkian's team, his room for manoeuvre in critical national security matters is somewhat limited, but I think the diplomatic openings that are being tentatively alluded to, and as we said, renewed push for a nuclear deal, that kind of thing, should be taken seriously. And that's especially precedent in light of what everyone said about the shift in debates within Iran on possible nuclear deterrent themselves. And finally, I think progress in these areas is often touted as a window to consultation on other issues by Iran. And although I think it's maybe somewhat fanciful to talk about a grand bargain, I don't think we should rule out the possibility of linking progress on issues such as the nuclear program or in regional rapprochement with former rivals that we're seeing to a broader de-escalation of tensions in the region. And I think Western powers certainly need to fully grasp the opportunities that this de-escalation can provide, and stand firm against the kind of increasing Israeli pressure to torpedo any tentative understanding with Iran. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Mr. Westnich, for your contribution. Then I will open the floor for the Q&A, and I will give the floor to Mr. van den Burg, who is member of the VVD, the Liberal Party in our parliament. Mr. van den Burg.
Thank you. We have, of course, sanctions, but when it comes to further weakening the military power of Iran, the West is depending on Israel. What can we do as Western countries? And first of all, to the combination, I think, of Mrs. Krajewski and Mr. Azizi.
I will give the floor then first to Ms. Krajewski.
Well, so I mean, in terms of sanctions or kind of targeting of Iranian entities, I think the European Union has done a pretty substantive job at targeting entities. I mean, the problem is that Iran has a network of shadow banking and also procurement that they use third-party intermediaries to get some of these equipment. When it comes to degrading Iranian missile force or its missile production, I mean, obviously the Israelis would prefer to do that through kinetic means. However, I think it doesn't seem like a feasible strategy in the long term. It seems like that actually would provoke Iran to make the decision to perhaps acquire a nuclear weapon if they do face kind of prolonged and continued attacks on missile production facilities or their industrial base when it comes to that. But I do think that the procurement networks are very important to look at. There's certain countries, like for example, Indonesia, that tends to be a place for that. Also, Hong Kong is one of the kind of export zones or re-export zones, and same with the UAE. And this is where you see a lot of the IRGC creating banking networks and trying to get some of the material necessary for some of these missiles. That would be my suggestion when it comes to particularly the missile force.
Thank you. And then I will hand the same question to Mr. Azizi.
In terms of the sanction, if we are strictly speaking about military sanctions or sanctions on military industry, I think the impacts of the sanctions have been already apparent. For example, one of the reasons that has been mentioned for for Russia not materializing the agreement to deliver Su-35 is the kind of advanced technology that it requires, and the fact that the future of the production line is into question. So when it comes to basically these advanced technologies that Iran wants to get from Russia, for example, the limits, the impact of the sanctions actually have been clear. But there's a variety of problems that limit basically the ability of Europe and also the United States to significantly impact Iran's military program, especially its missile program. We shouldn't forget that the Iranian missile and drone program have been developed under the sanctions. So sanctions on Russia are kind of more recent, but for Iran, they have been in place for years. One of the areas Iran has been working on, actually two areas. One has been the use of dual-use technologies, and in the West, there has been kind of increasingly stricter measures against the export of dual-use technologies. But now we are increasingly seeing evidence of Chinese technology used, for example, in Iranian drones. So this is something that I think there's little the West in general, especially Europe, can do about. Also another area that Iran has worked on has been the reverse engineering of the technology that it has acquired. And for example, some of the more advanced air defense systems that Iran has are based on this. So I think realistically speaking, the limits of the sanction policy on Iran's military program, again, strictly speaking, has become already somehow apparent.
Thank you. I want to continue on the answer that Mr. Azizi gave on. You also mentioned in your introduction about the relationship between Iran and Russia. You also just mentioned China. Could you tell us who are the friends of Iran in the region and who are helping them to, well, who's helping them? Let me put it that way.
That's a great question. And this is one of the notions that is discussed it has become actually a hot debate within Iran as well. And there has been a concept called strategic loneliness, which refers to the fact that Iran doesn't have any allies, actually, from great powers or from regional powers. And this is one of the reasons that is usually referred to as one of the driving factors behind Iran's proxy policy and the use of basically this kind of non-state network. But, be it Russia or China, when it comes to significantly supporting Iran, for example, now that it faces the risk of a war with Israel or even the United States, the limits of these partnerships have become quite clear. So the maximum we can expect from Russia, for example, in the case of an Israeli response and further escalation would be the provision of intelligence, for example, what it has already done, providing not only Iran but its allies like Hezbollah with satellite data to be used against Israel and things like that, and probably helping Iran further strengthen its air defense. But Russia is not going to come to Iran's aid, especially not at this time that is itself struggling on the Ukraine front. The same is about China. China has adopted a very cautious policy, and it doesn't want to engage in the conflicts in the Middle East or basically in other regions, generally speaking. And Iran knows this. I think one of the reasons behind the recent diplomatic maneuvering by Iran, for example, what we saw in the UN General Assembly is that the Iranian government knows that at the end of the day, they need a deal with the West in order to balance their relationship with Eastern countries. They know that these countries are not their allies, and there has been a desire for balancing the relationship, despite the growing reliance and growing military partnership with Russia, for example.
Thank you, Mr. Azizi. And then I hand the floor once again to Mr. van den Burg.
No, I don't really have extra questions.
Okay. Then I have some questions to I have a question to Mr. Westnich. You talked about the new president taking the office, that would be that the administration would be more open with him taking the office. But I hear, and knowing that the Ayatollah is the real leader of the country, how do you see it that it will be more open? That's not the things I hear from people who know Iran.
Sure, thank you. Good question. Of course, I mean, I alluded to this briefly in my talk that his room for manoeuvre is limited. We know that the key national security, critical national security concerns of Iran are dealt with at National Security Council level and under the purview of the supreme leader. So, of course, you know, there is the final say on all core national security issues, and with the RGC very prominent in those, particularly in terms of the Middle East. However, I think what's interesting about the role of successive Iranian presidential administrations here is that they offer this, I would say, this sort of diplomatic facade, you know. So rather than, you know, you can't compare them to, say, you know, the president or, you know, leader of other countries we might be familiar with, even in the region, but they are, you know, acting as Iran's representatives on the world stage. Hence this sort of, you know, emphasis you see, great emphasis placed on, you know, bodies like the UN, the fact that they are undertaking so much diplomatic activity at the moment. And I think that provides a kind of, you know, it might be paying lip service to international norms a little bit, but it's trying to assert, like I say, this sort of, you know, moral high ground, saying we're adhering to international norms, we're, you know, kind of open to dialogue and are actually pressing for de-escalation. Now, of course, you know, cynics rightfully would point to other activities that might run counter to that. But I think we're seeing, you know, the fact that Pezeshkian was even allowed to stand and that he was allowed to be elected despite the strictures of the Iranian, you know, quasi-democratic system, I think show that there is a realization that slightly more pragmatic voices need to come to the fore and that they might serve in Iran's international position more, you know, in a more pragmatic and suitable way. And so I think that's why, you know, we have to be open to dealing with these kind of politicians who have got vast diplomatic experience. If you look at some of the diplomats that's, you know, been employed by the administration, Arakchi and others, you know, these are people who have long dealt with the West and have the respect of you know, Western policymakers or diplomats or what have you. So I think it's a good opportunity to take advantage of that. A green light's be given to them essentially to act on the behalf of the broader leadership.
Thank you for the answer. Where they are, and I heard also that's something that it could be weaponized into with 6 to 18 months. Is there any clear view on where they are with their nuclear capabilities? Do we think that they can have a weapon and use it in the next 12 months, 24 months? I don't know who wants to take this question. Let me then choose someone. I think Mr. Valles talked also about the nuclear capabilities.
Sure. Let me just add a few additional layers to what I said. CIA Director Bill Burns recently said that it basically takes less than a week for Iran to enrich enough uranium for a single nuclear weapon. Now, as I said in my opening remarks, that's not a bomb. It's like having the ingredients for a cake, but you still have to bake it into a cake and weaponize it. Given the work that Iran had done on nuclear weapons pre-2003, the estimates vary from 6 to 18 months that the weaponization process takes. What I talked about, the less than 7-day process of enriching uranium to weapons grade, is called breakout in technical terms. However, my own guess is that this is not the pathway that Iran would choose to pursue weaponization, because breakout happens in facilities that are declared to the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN nuclear watchdog, Although some of these sites are very well protected under mountains, very highly fortified, but this would allow probably very rapid detection and, again, invites a U.S. or Israeli strike on these facilities. Whereas in the past 3 years, as a result of former President Trump's withdrawal from the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran, the IAEA has lost oversight over the equipment that Iran has produced, centrifuges, especially advanced centrifuges. So most likely in the course of the past 3 years that we have had very little knowledge about what Iran has done, they have developed hundreds of advanced centrifuges. And it is quite possible that these centrifuges are now in clandestine secret facilities that would allow Iran to sneak out towards nuclear weapons and not break out. I do believe that the game would be lost as soon as Iran would move the nuclear material out of the IAEA's purview into these secret facilities where it can already have installed a lot of advanced centrifuges. So that's the main risk that we face, that in a very short period of time, Iran can use its know-how and the highly enriched nuclear material in order to be able to dash towards nuclear weapons. And then the weaponization process would happen in secret, and it will be very difficult to stop it until and unless one has very good intelligence about where some of these secret sites are. And as I said, having a nuclear weapon doesn't necessarily mean that Iran would be able to marry it to a ballistic missile system very quickly, very easily. It has to test them. And then, again, even that would not provide this regime with the kind of security that it has in mind, because it has other issues that are threatening its existence. Its economy is a major point of vulnerability. And I think over the past few years, the leadership has realized that the only way its economic situation can improve is not through relying on Russia and China to throw it a lifeline, or to rely on Iran's internal capacities in what they call the economy of resistance, but rather to get economic reprieve from the West and get some of the sanctions lifted. Obviously, this is a regime that faces serious issues of legitimacy, and even though they've brought in an administration, the Pezeshkian administration, which is tasked to try to narrow the gap between the state and the society, so far, at least, its record on that front has not been successful. And again, it's faced with adversaries that are much more powerful than it from a conventional military perspective, like Israel and the United States. So it really does not resolve its issues. But what I worry about particularly is that for the past 20 years of a nuclear standoff between the West and Iran, the Iranian leadership has always denied that it has any intention to develop nuclear weapons. There is a religious fatwa by the supreme leader banning nuclear weapons, and this was a taboo subject in the country until a few years ago. First, we saw expert communities talking about the utility of weaponization. Then we saw former officials. Then we saw sitting officials. Then we saw military officials. And today, almost everyone is talking about it. And that psychological threshold, I think, has already been crossed. And my concern is that if the doctrine is changed, eventually any country with nuclear weapons know-how and with sheer determination can get there, whether it passes through a conflict or not. But the experience of the previous 9 nuclear weapon states clearly demonstrate to us that that would be the ultimate destination if there is a decision. And I'm worried that the current tensions in the region would eventually, as my colleagues also mentioned, would eventually bring that change in doctrine. And from that point on, I think we would be in a much more perilous situation.
Thank you very much for the answer. I'm looking to the other panelists. Anybody else want to give their point of view on the nuclear program? No?
I'm happy to add a little bit to this.
Please.
I mean, and Dr. Baez really touched on this, but Iran has accumulated a mass amount of enriched uranium, mostly around 20% enriched uranium, but this is far more than what was allowed under the JCPOA. I think it was 300 kilograms of uranium under the JCPOA enriched at natural levels. Right now, I mean, Iran, I think, has in total, I think 3 to 4 times that, but at different levels of enrichment. But it does take a process that you have to convert this from, a liquid form, either like an oxide or a gas form, into metal and so that conversion process is something that also takes time. And so whereas Iran has the ability to do that, and I think we've already seen Iran has done work with uranium metal, but they haven't done this at the scale necessary for a nuclear weapon. So Iran basically has this as kind of a, I guess, security, like in somewhat of an insurance policy. I think with the weaponization side of it, it's interesting because under the JCPOA, Section T in particular outlines certain activities that have are mostly intended for any kind of like nuclear use. And so this is work with like detonators or combined computer code to simulate a nuclear explosion. I think that needs to be a focus. I mean, right now, especially the role of the European Union and the E3, I think this really should be a priority, is to have some sort of agreement, at least even outside of the JCPOA, of some verification measures when it does come to Section T, which are the more weaponization related provisions in the JCPOA. Because the IAEA is not really having the ability to monitor anything within Iran. And as Dr. Baez alluded to and mentioned, this could be happening in covert facilities. This could be happening, and we have no idea because we don't have monitoring at the moment, or really any kind of access to this. So some sort of agreement, or at least accord, where there is a modicum of monitoring or a modicum of transparency when it comes to Section T activities, I think really should be the priority at this point. Within the IAEA, there tends to be this focus on Iran's previous activities, its potential military dimension, activities from prior to the JCPOA from 2003. Whereas I think that's critically important. That should not be the priority at the moment. I think the moment should be verifying and making sure that Iran is not doing those activities at the moment which are under Section T. And so it does call for kind of a recalibration of strategy when it comes to addressing the nuclear issue. But that would be my recommendation. And I do think that the timeline for Iran to actually create a usable advanced nuclear device is much longer than some of the estimates. I think it would take around a year and a half or so. I'm much more skeptical on the closer end of that. But they do have enough fissile material. They just haven't converted all of that into uranium metal, and then they haven't miniaturized it and used it for a device. And they do have warheads that technically could be nuclear deliverable, but they haven't really shown any work on trying to do that thus far. So that would be my priority, is the Section T in particular, and transparency there.
Thank you.